Hello, I'm Rodger Baker. I'm joined today by Dr. Jay Ogilvy, and we're going to discuss a little bit about a recent article that he's written on heterarchy. Jay, the article you've written for Global Affairs discusses the concept of heterarchy as sort of a third way of looking at global power structures comparatively with anarchy and with hierarchy. How do you really understand this concept, and how do we apply that in looking at the world?
Well, I think first by contrasting it with hierarchy. A formal definition of hierarchy is if A is over B and B is over C, then A is over C. In a heterarchy, you can have A over B, B over C, and C over A. Think of the game of paper, rock, and scissors. Paper covers rock, rock crushes scissors, scissors cuts paper. That's one simple example of a real heterarchy. But there are others.
So as we use heterarchy as a way of looking at the world, are we talking about looking at, say, the relationship between the United States and other countries and their ability to maneuver around the United States, or is this something a little bit more complex?
No, I think you can use it in a bunch of different domains. Our friend Philip Bobbitt does a beautiful exposition of the kind of hierarchical relationships between the East Asia, particularly Japan, North America, and Europe. He develops in great detail how really the idea of being number one is a very hierarchical idea. It's not necessarily the case that somebody's got to be number one. You know the old saying that the lion is the king of the jungle. I think that's a saying that's driven by a kind of hierarchical mindset that insists that somebody's got to be number one, but there's no king in the jungle.
So in some ways, this is a concept that fits a little with the way in which China, for example, portrays itself in East Asia, where it argues that the relationships in East Asia shouldn't be about, well, you're allied with the United States or you're allied with China, that there's a very complex set of relationships. And also the way in which when we look at that space, we see, for example, treaty allies with the United States have very close economic ties with China, and therefore they can't visualize the world in this bilateral or bipolar situation.
Yeah. Heterarchy allows us to, I think, get a better grasp on very complex situations like Syria. I mean, you see such complex relationships, say, Russia going after the opponents of Assad, even as Russia is taking materials up to our space station. I mean, who is against whom all of the time, but sometimes not all of the time. The complex relationships between Turkey, between Syria, Russia, the United States. A heterarchical analysis is going to be truer to the reality than insisting on asking who's number one.
It helps us understand the complexity, certainly. But does it ease decision making?
I think it does. Riva wrote a very interesting column recently where she argued that our American mentality towards Russia is not as complex and layered as the Russian mentality. And she made the point that if you take a kind of realpolitik perspective on Russia, there's a satisfaction with small wins and never the expectation of total victory.
Some could argue that that's sort of a result of the Cold War and their inability to win it. And the United States continues with that concept. But I guess the U.S. had to face this challenge through its history too. So you come out of World War II, you have the concept of total victory. But really there hasn't been a war since then that ends in this same structure of total victory. So you don't have one dominant power that's very clearly the dominant power.
Philip Bobbitt also has made that point that we've got to revise our sense of victory. As we look at geopolitics, we don't do well to use football or tennis as the metaphor where there's got to be a winner. We're in these perpetual standoffs around the world that I think we'll do better decision-making if we anticipate these heterarchical relationships than if we expect either a hierarchy or anarchy, by the way. I mean, our former colleague, Robert Kaplan, wrote this famous article in The Atlantic on the coming anarchy. My sense is that many anarchists are disappointed hierarchists. They have this hierarchical mind view, and then they look at the world and it's not justified. The world simply isn't as rational as a kind of org chart in a corporation. And they come away saying, well, if I can't have hierarchy, then anarchy. And I think that's an error.
Well, I think this is definitely something that we're going to have to keep looking at as we shape our view of the world, as we understand the way in which the world works. And it seems to be a very useful tool to be able to utilize. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for more on this and other topics, please see us at stratfor.com.